And I'd like to welcome everyone to our next presentation, our second presentation in the beginner stream with Bruce Pollock talking to us about the people behind the cover. Let me just read a brief bio from Bruce. Bruce Pollock is the president of the Victoria Stamp Club and returned to collecting after his retirement. His initial focus was on Canadian mint stamps up to 1967, but he has recently become interested in the stamps of Denmark and Iceland. His presentation about the people behind the cover explains how he drifted into postal history. Let me also just mention that Bruce is a member of the board of the Royal Philatelic Society and has been a tremendously valuable sort of member of our PHSC, team, in particular, taking the lead in the Zoom presentations under the covers. So let me pass it over to you, Bruce. I will stop share and invite you to continue.
Well, thank you, Bob. Are we coming through okay here? All right. Well, yeah, thank you. This is, it's a bit of an explanation of how I sort of woke up one morning and realized I was really interested in postal history, and I hadn't really started out that way. I was really more interested in the stamps themselves, but this explains how that kind of came about and gives a bit more of an explanation of things I learned along the way. I've been very fortunate here in Victoria to have quite a few mentors, and Bob is one of them. And another one is Gray Scrimger, who many people will know. He's well known across the country for his experience in postal history, and particularly in British Columbia. And he's a member of our club, and I've spent a lot of time talking with him about postal history. And one day I asked him, what's the difference between a stamp collector and a postal historian? And he said, well, sometimes I even look at the stamp. And what he meant by that was, most of us who are interested in postal history don't really spend a lot of time looking at the stamps. We're interested in what's happening on the cover or on the postcard. And it may well be that we've got some really scarce stamp material that's sitting on that cover, but honestly, I wouldn't know because I very seldom look at them. But it's interesting that as you start to shift your focus between collecting stamps and collecting postal history, that you really do change the way you look at the material that you have. I thought that was kind of profound. So traditionally, postal history has been the study of rates and routes and markings and post offices. In other words, how did a particular item get from this point to that point? Of course, there were millions of users of the mails historically, but unless those users were famous, it was really difficult to learn much about them. If you're just Joe average public, we probably would never have learned much about you. But it's also true that, the stories of our history are made up of unknown people, not just the great and the famous. And so what I found was there's lots of things you can do to learn about these people who were not great and famous, but just regular people who happen to be using the mail. There's, of course, many research sources that we have today, and it's much easier to learn about the people who use the mails. And of course, the most obvious one is general internet searches like Google. I make a great deal of use of Ancestry.com, and I'll talk a little bit about my interest in family history. But I've used Ancestry.com to great effect to learn about the names of and learn about the people whose names appear on the covers. There's also lots of online newspaper archives that we can find. I've got a number of local history books in the areas where I'm interested, and I've also been able to make direct contact with some family members in a couple of situations, which was profoundly important to my research. So I guess it's true that you have to have a bit of an interest in research in order to be, to get into postal history at all. But for me, it started when I was a kid. I've always been interested in history. I have early memories of sitting at my grandmother's kitchen table looking at old back issues of the London Illustrated News. And along the way, I also became very interested in my own family history. And my family came primarily from the Cowichan Valley of British Columbia, and we're going back to the pioneer days. And so that was really, it became a pretty easy focus for me when I started to collect postal history material. I started to focus on material from the Cowichan Valley. And after a while, and after sort of joining the PHSC and talking to other collectors, I realized I wasn't doing it right. I wasn't really paying as much attention to the rates and the routes and the markings in the post office as I was supposed to be. And I found that also that I tended to collect people, not the covers. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that, which may sound a bit weird, but it's very true that I have looked at covers and eventually have acquired them, not because of what was on the cover, but who sent it or who received it, which is a kind of I would suggest kind of a backwards way of coming at postal history. And this is one early example. The cover on the right is sent to Mrs. Margaret Aucheineke in 1861, sent from Huntly in Scotland to where she lives in a little place called Keith and a farm outside of Keith called Cotterton. It's got a 1 penny red on it. It's in kind of rough shape. The cover on the left was addressed to Miss Edith Castley in Duncan Station, BC, from Duncan Station to Duncan Station. And at first glance, there really wouldn't be much of a connection between these two covers. But it turns out that, and this cover on the right, actually what came to me, it was handed down by an aunt of mine who also collected postal material. And when she found I was interested and also interested in family history, she passes on to me. So this is my great-great-grandmother, Margaret Aucheineke, in 1861, before the family left Scotland to move to North America. But the connection between these two covers is here. This is my great-grandfather standing in the lower right-hand corner, Peter. And it turns out that he was on a work party who was clearing Castley land in Salmonose, BC, which is in the Cowichan Valley. And so it took me a while to kind of put two and two together to make four, but there is very much a connection between those two covers through my family because the Castleys have been in the Cowichan Valley for many years, as have my own ancestors. And this is one of the things that really kind of got me going. When you start to realize in a small location like the Cowichan Valley, people keep cropping up from time to time, and they are actually, there's many connections between them. And similarly, I was browsing through the material of Furman Wendell's from Weta Stamps here in Victoria a few years ago, and looking through his box of stuff, and I came across this cover addressed to SPR, which stands for Sapper, J. Pollock in Summerland. Well, as soon as I saw the name, I knew who it was. Because on the Pollock side of my family, they lived in Summerland, and this is my great uncle Jack. So of course I had to buy this cover. It's a little bit scarce because the postmark on it is Strawberry Vale, which is an old post office here in the Victoria area. And it was sent by the BC Bantam Regiment after the First World War. So the date on it is the 28th of July, 1919. Now, what this cover allowed me to do, now that I had Uncle Jack's, I'm not sure whether you call it an ID number, but his Army service number allowed me to go into the archives of Canada and pull up all of his old World War I records. And it turns out that the BC Bantams were a regiment formed here in Victoria, and they did their training down in Beacon Hill Park. This is for men who were too short to join the regular army. You had to be 5'4" in order to be able to join the army. Uncle Jack was only 5'2½", according to his records. And so they wouldn't take him into the army, but he was a carpenter. and he was needed in the war. And so this regiment was put together of men who were otherwise too short or otherwise unable to join the regular army, but they still had much to offer. And Uncle Jack went over to France during the war, and he worked repairing rail cars during the First World War. So this is another example of stumbling across something about my family as I've been doing some, acquiring from my collection. And there's similarly, this one seems a bit odd. I found this in a local dealer's dollar box. I was just browsing through the material one day, and this one popped out at me. Now, I bought it for two reasons. First of all, I spent 8 years of my life in Fort St. John, and one 4-year period in the early 1960s where I started started school in Fort St. John, and then later in the 1980s. And this cover connects me to both of those periods. If you're not familiar with the geography of northwestern Canada, Fort St. John is at the end of that red line down there, which is the red line is the Alaska Highway, which of course was built during the Second World War to allow the Americans to transport material all the way up to Alaska for defense against Japan. The actual terminus is Dawson Creek, which is about 48 or 49 miles south of Fort St. John. So when I was browsing through this dollar box, the first thing that caught my eye was Fort St. John, so that got me interested. But the thing that really got me interested was it was the Condell Cafe. And I had no idea who George Yip was, but I bought it simply because Condell Cafe in Fort St. John. Well, it turned out that I went back to the same dealer a little while later, and he had another one addressed to Mr. George Yip, Condell Cafe, Fort St. John. Both of these covers came from the Philippines. The Condell Hotel, there's a picture of it here. I mean, they're probably in the early 60s, I would say. The Condell Hotel was built during the war, during the construction of the Alaska Highway, and for many years in Fort St. John, which is not a big place, it was kind of one of the foremost hotels in Fort St. John. But, so this was in the 1960s when I first lived up there. When I went back in the early 1980s and was working in a sawmill up there, the hotel had kind of fallen into disrepair and eventually was torn down in 2018. I have a rather unfortunate story, which I'm not going to share, about my bachelor party, which dragged its way through the bar of the Condell Hotel one night before I got married. So that was another thing that attracted me to the Condell Hotel. But there's an additional connection here, apart from my unfortunate night in the bar, and that is that Mr. George Yip was actually the first Asian councillor who was elected to the Fort St. John Council. He was elected in January 1957, and there's some pictures here of that council, as well as the interior of the Condell Hotel, which I got from the museum up at Fort St. John. But the connections don't end there. This picture of the city council, I'm not sure exactly what year it was, but this council was the council that actually hired my father. My father worked for the city of Fort St. John as the city clerk. And the gentleman standing in the middle of this picture is Mayor Frank Spicer. And when my family and I moved to Fort St. John in October 31st of 1961, our house wasn't ready to move into yet, and our furniture hadn't arrived. And so Mayor Frank Spicer put us up in his house. So I have a direct personal connection to Mayor Frank Spicer, and also tangentially to Mr. Yip. So this is when for me, these are the connections that start to come out when you start to do a bit of research into the people who use the mails. This is where it starts to get really exciting for me. This one here is an interesting cover because I bought it for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's messy. And I love messy covers. It's got all kinds of markings on it. It's got cancels, it's got stains, it's got everything. I love messy covers. But I bought it primarily because it came out of Cowichan Station, which is a tiny, tiny little place in the Cowichan Valley. It was one of the stations on the line of the Esquimalt and Nanaimo Railway early on. But the thing that really attracted me to it is I was trying to understand who would have some business in New York City that they had to send a registered letter from this tiny little place in the middle of nowhere to New York. And so after I received the cover, I started to do a bit of research into it. And the first thing I did was go into Google and start looking for this address. And if you start searching for E.M. McDonald on Vesey Street, the thing that pops up immediately is the Free Thought newspaper or magazine periodical. And it turns out, and this is the back of that cover, and you can see it's also pretty messy. And it tracks the cover going from Cowichan Station down the railway post office down to Victoria, and then to Seattle and over to New York. It became pretty easy and I was surprised how easy it was actually to find out that E.M. McDonald was in fact the editor and publisher of the Truth Seeker periodical, which happens to be the oldest free thought publication in the world, and in fact is still in publication today. And it makes it one of the oldest American periodicals. So I'm presuming then that this registered cover was probably containing subscription money from somebody in Cowichan Station down to New York City to make sure they continued to get their paper. So I found it really interesting. Mark Twain was a frequent contributor to the Truth Seeker, and they've also had many other famous authors write for them over the years as well. So that's Mr. Montague, Eugene Montague McDonald on the right-hand side. Early on, when I was collecting my family history and trying to learn more about my family through internet searching, I came across a publication by the provincial government from 1898 that listed all of the persons who were entitled to vote in that district as of June 13th, 1898. I got it primarily because it was fun just to kind of look down the list and see your ancestors' names. And I didn't really think too much about this voters list until I started to accumulate material from the Valley. And I whenever I found anything that looked of interest from the Valley, I just tried to pick it up if I could. And it was only after a while I started to realize that many of the names that were on this voters list were actually connected through this. Once I realized that the material I was collecting was actually addressed to or from a member of this voters list. Sometimes it was the actual named voter, and sometimes it was a family member. So I started to research each one of these people as I collected these items. So this is just one example. This is a postcard, postal stationery card sent in September 1900 from John Bell, who you see highlighted in the voters list at the top. John Bell was a very early settler in the Cowichan Valley, and he was also an early councillor for the district of North Cowichan, and he served 6 terms in the late 1800s and up into 1907. And the interesting thing about this is that he is writing down to the Majestic Manufacturing Company in St. Louis, Missouri, inquiring about their kitchen ranges, and supposedly he wants to buy a range from Missouri and have it shipped up. I guess he didn't get any free shipping out of Amazon back in those days. I would be interested to know how much it would cost to ship a range all the way from St. Louis, Missouri up to North Cowichan. But in any event, it's cool to be able to find material from these people. This is another interesting example. I find this fascinating. So the context here is this is a postcard from Robert Colvin, who lived at Cowichan Station, the place we were talking about. It's sent to his wife. It's dated February the 24th, 1905. He mailed it from a little place called Coxila, which was about only maybe 6 or 8 kilometers from his home post office, which was Cowichan Station. So what the message says, and it's kind of a bit hard to see, but it says that he has to go up to Chemainus on the SS Georgia, which was one of the coastal boats that ran up and down the east coast of Vancouver Island. He had to go up to Chemainus, which was not that far away. It's about, I don't know, maybe 20 or 25 kilometers from Duncan. And it says, I'll be back on Saturday the 25th, which is basically tomorrow. So picture this, you've gone down to the hardware store to buy some stuff. I'm making this up. And you realize that what you need, you can't get there, and you have to go up to Chemainus to get what you need. So you send your wife a text. No, you don't send her a text, you send her a postcard. And you say, I won't be home tonight because I got to go to Chemainus, I'll be back tomorrow. So it was kind of mind-boggling to me that a postcard can be used that quickly. And in fact, it was received by her the same day that he sent it. And so she knew that night that he wouldn't be home. I find that just remarkable. But even more interesting is that his wife, Jeremina, was quite important in the history of the Cowichan tribes here in the Cowichan Valley. You may be familiar with the famous Cowichan sweater. Well, Jeremina, after doing a bit of research, I learned that she was quite important in helping the Cowichan women develop their knitting techniques, particularly around the shoulder of their sweaters. The Scottish and other European settlers brought knitting to the First Nations people. Of course, they had been weaving for many, many years before European contact, but knitting was something that was introduced by the Europeans. And the First Nations women started to adapt to knitting, and eventually started to knit what became known as the Cowichan sweater, very famous worldwide. And Jeremina was quite important in helping them with developing their knitting techniques. And this one, we're back to my family again. I keep coming across material that's to some weird branch of my family. The voter in this particular case, the connection here is John William Flett, who was the husband of my great aunt Mary. We knew her as Mamie. So John and Mary Flett were people. I didn't know John, he died before I was born, but I have vivid memories of having tea with Aunt Mary, Aunt Mamie as we knew her, and Mabel, who was her daughter. We would quite often go to have tea at Mabel and Aunt Mamie's house. So I just happened to come across this card or this postcard as well, which was written by a very young Mabel Flett in about 1907 to one of her friends. There was a lot of action out of Cowichan Station. I don't know why that is. Pasquale Frumento, who you see highlighted at the top in the voters list. I've got a couple of pieces from this family. This was a letter card that was sent by Pasquale down to Victoria, to the greengrocers of Wilson Brothers in Victoria. And he's basically telling them that he'll be in town, i.e. in Victoria, sometime this week. And I guess he owes them some money, and he says he's going to stop by and pay them, but he's apologizing because he can't come any sooner. But Pasquale and his wife Maria operated the hotel and general store and post office at Cowichan Station, and he also served as its postmaster between 1897 and his death in 1919. So again, you can learn a lot about people once you start digging a little bit online. The next one is the story of William Henry Lomas, who was another very early settler in the Cowichan Valley. I'm not 100% positive, but I'm pretty sure that this Miss Lomas in this, who's addressed, or the recipient of this card, was likely William Henry Lomas's daughter. He came to the Cowichan Valley in the early 1970s. He was the first school teacher in the district, And there are stories about how he used to take kids across Salmonos Lake in his canoe so that they could attend his classes. In 1881, he was appointed as the Indian agent, which was a provincial appointment as far as I know, the first such appointment in BC. And the Indian agent was supposed to be a communications conduit between the provincial government and the local tribes. And my understanding is he was very well respected by the First Nations people. And he learned to speak their language and spent a lot of time arguing on their behalf. Now, so that was the end of my material on the Cowichan voters list, but that's actually, I've had enough material there. I've turned it into a two-frame exhibit. This next section is talking about how what started off as a very simple purchase turned into a huge and frankly very rewarding output in terms of exhibiting and in collecting research. This cover was the first one I bought, again from Furman Wendell's, who's one of our local dealers and has many resources, material from BC, Postal History Resources. And I bought this cover for two reasons. First of all, the Zuhalem post office is not extremely scarce, but it's a little bit on the scarcer side, and that was attractive to me. The other reason was the name, Maitland-Dougall. I'm not related to the Maitland-Dougals, but I did have an ancestor's husband who was named Maitland. And so I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. I bought it simply because of the postmark, Zuhalem, and the name, Maitland. And it was interesting. As I said earlier, I found myself accumulating all kinds of material that came to or from the Cowichan Valley. So when I got at home and I just started doing a little bit of digging, and I ran a Google search for Maitland-Dougall in Hazelton because I assumed that the Maitland-Dougals lived in Hazelton. And what exploded for me was a huge story. The first thing I found was an obituary for James Maitland-Dougall. And this is the article that was in the Victoria Daily Colonist back in, I forget the year. And it was instrumental in helping me understand how the family, the family history. And it explained how and why he came to be in Hazelton and what his role was in going up there. And it was instrumental in helping me learn more about it. But even more importantly was the fact that when I bought the first piece from Furman, he told me that he had a great many other pieces from or to the same family. And over the next few years, I managed to accumulate quite a bit of stuff. So after doing the initial Google search, I then went on Ancestry.com and started to find more about the family history of James Maitland-Dougall. And it's interesting when you go into Ancestry.com that at the top here is the listing, one of the listings for Mr. Maitland-Dougall, and right below that is a listing for this is my great aunt here, Maud O'Kainiki, whose name you've seen before, and her husband, Jim Maitland, who I have well remember. So I just found it interesting when I started doing this search. This is how things popped up, and there's a connection here between these two listings in Ancestry.com. And we're going to come back to a little bit more about the history of James in a few minutes, but this is one of the reasons why Ancestry.com can be so important, because all of a sudden I've got this treasure trove of information and history about this particular family, including over here his parents, his wife, and also his sons, which we're going to spend a few minutes talking about. So, as I said, over the last few years, I've been able to acquire more than 30 items. And my research tells me that pretty well all of them were collected by Gerald Welburn, who of course is one of our preeminent postal historians here in BC. My theory is that because he lived in Duncan, My theory is that after Mrs. Maitland-Dougal passed away, that Jerry managed to acquire all of the material that she was a collector herself. She was a stamp collector herself. And I think this stuff was all picked up by Jerry Wilbur. And it led to me doing an extensive amount of research into the family story. And this particular cover here is dated 1904. It's to James Maitland-Dougal. The timing of it suggests that it was likely related to the death of Winifred. Winifred was James's wife. It was most likely related to the death of her sister, who lived in Alberni at the time. This is from Alberni, BC, which is in the interior of Vancouver Island. So again, I learned about the death of Winifred's sister, Marjorie, by going on to Ancestry.com. There's also a connection to the gentleman we were talking about a few minutes ago, Mr. William Henry Lomas. James became the chief or a constable with the provincial police force in Duncan, and tragically, Mr. Lomas took his own life in 1899, and it turns out that James Maitland-Dougal, Constable Maitland-Dougal, was in the next room when Mr. Lomas shot himself through the head. It was a tragic situation, and there was never really any explanation as to why he did it, but this is a selection from the news report. James was born in Fife, Scotland in 1867. His wife Winifred was born in Yorkshire in 1873. They had two sons, William and Hamish. We're going to talk more about them in a few minutes. Another curious thing I found about James, he came from a long line of Royal Navy officers. In fact, one of his ancestors was Rear Admiral Sir Frederick Maitland, who apparently was in command of HMS Bellerophon after the Battle of Waterloo in Europe. And when Napoleon surrendered after the Battle of Waterloo, and he had hordes of unhappy countrymen chasing him out of the country, he fled to the arms of Sir Frederick and was taken on board HMS Bellerophon and transported over to Britain. So there's a connection between James Maitland-Dougal and Napoleon. So at this particular time, as I said, James was a constable. He started with the police force in 1892. His obituary said that he showed a talent for police work, and apparently he solved 8 different murders up and down Vancouver Island. But then in about 1899, he became the government agent. But for some reason, in the summer of 1909, he went back into police work. He gave up his role as the government agent in Duncan. And this is why we now find him in Hazelton, and the correspondence within the original slide to Mrs. Maitland-Dougal up in Hazelton. What was happening was that at the time, in the around about 1909, there was a great deal of unrest from the First Nations people. And it's probably not hard to understand why, that none of these tribes had ever been offered the ability to negotiate any kind of treaty with the provincial government. And the natives, the native tribes were becoming more and more threatening. There was acts of vandalism against construction projects, etc. And the settlers up there were getting very anxious. And the provincial government decided that they needed to do something about this, and they decided that James might be the guy to do something. So he was, because of this capability that they saw in him, he was asked to take on the role of chief constable in Hazelton, and he went up there in the summer of 1909. The article on the right-hand side explains and describes a pre-dawn raid that James led to arrest a number of the First Nations leaders who were seen as breeders of trouble. We'll kind of come back to this a little bit. But during this time, the two boys, William and Hamish, remained in Duncan, and this letter in the center here is a written on birch bark by James to his son William, and it was dated in September of 1909, and it talks about having to get this. He thought that William might be interested in seeing a letter on birch bark, and he has to get it down to the post office and get it mailed because the next mail boat's leaving pretty soon. So the boys are back in Duncan. In March of 1910, this letter was sent by William to his mother, who's up in Hazleton, and it's written the day after his 15th birthday, and he's writing to thank his parents for the gifts that he got. And it's interesting that part of the thing that he talks about in here is his own stamp collection. So both him and his mother were collectors of stamps. So he's writing to his mother, who's up in Hazleton, while he's in boarding school in Duncan. And this is an album page that was created by Gerald Welburn, showing covers from Kispiox and Kitselis, and the lower one is actually judging by the handwriting, it was a letter from Winifred, the mother, to Hamish, the younger son. So in 1910, you may, if you're familiar with your naval history, the Royal Canadian Navy was created, and at the same time, the Royal Naval College of Canada was created. Britain had been demanding that each of its colonies should start contributing to the cost of the Royal Navy that was protecting their shores, and most countries like Australia, New Zealand, and Canada all objected to that. And the Canadian government decided it was going to create its own navy. So that's how the Royal Navy came to be in 1910. And during this period, William applied for and was accepted into the very first class of the Royal Naval College of Canada. In fact, when he wrote his entrance exam, when he was 15 years old, he scored the highest mark in all of Canada to attend the first class back in Halifax. So you can imagine this. By now, he was 16 years old by the time he actually arrived in Halifax. He had to take the train across the country by himself. That picture in the lower right-hand corner is that first class, and William is standing in the back row in the center. And he was apparently one of their most outstanding students in the college. Shown here are two pieces that were addressed to Cadet William Maitland Dougal. The top one is a postcard sent by his brother Hamish. And it's interesting that this was sent to the Admiralty in London, but was forwarded on to Bermuda, because by this point, William was serving on HMS Barrack, which was based out of the West Indies station down in Bermuda. So the postcard is from his brother Hamish. The cover down on the bottom left-hand corner is from his father, James, and you can see it's got the stationery mark of the government agent in Duncan. So after graduating from the college, the cadets were expected to serve 1 year as a midshipman, and William's assignment was on HMS Barrack. And so there's letters from home finding their way to him on board HMS Barrack, someplace out in the West Indies. Now, of course, we're talking about the period leading up to the First World War. And as you'll see, both brothers joined the forces. And it's the Library of Archives Canada does make available all of his personnel records from the First World War. And so it was quite easy to pull up all of the records of both James and Hamish, or sorry, William and Hamish. But the story has a tragic ending. Both boys were killed in the war. Hamish was killed at Vimy Ridge on April the 9th, 1917. and William was killed by what was later determined to be friendly fire. William went on to become, first of all, the youngest commander, the youngest Canadian commander of a ship in history, the history of Canada. My understanding is he was also the first submarine commander, first Canadian submarine commander, because eventually, after he'd been with the Navy for a number of years in the First World War, he was given command of HMS D3, and that's a picture of the submarine there. All of his career was spent in submarines. The picture on the bottom left is William sitting on the front with his crew climbing up behind him. It was tragic that both boys were killed within about a year of each other. The even worse was that it took quite some time for them to determine that Hamish had actually died at Vimy Ridge, and that these are records pulled out of the Library and Archives personnel records. At first, it was reported that he'd only been wounded and missing, and it took a couple of months before they determined and confirmed that he'd actually been he died in action. So it was a tragic ending to the both boys, and you can imagine the impact it had on their parents. This is a picture in the bottom left-hand corner of the cenotaph in Duncan, BC, and that's a picture of Winifred in the middle there in her later years. She was actually asked to unveil the cenotaph after the First World War, after it was erected, in honor and recognition of the fact that she had lost both of her sons and only children in the First World War. And this is a kind of point with knowing that history of what happened to the boys. This is kind of a poignant letter. It's actually a folded letter envelope. So it's a letter folded up and then stamped and addressed on the front. It was sent to Hamish, who was visiting his aunt and grandmother up in Port Alberni, while his mother was back in Duncan. And she's basically giving him instructions about what to do, because it's just about time to return home to go to school, and this is in 1911. So she talks about buying a gift for his aunt and his grandmother, and news from home, etc. So it was obvious to me that Winifred was extremely close to the boys, and I think in particular Hamish. And you can't imagine how tragic it would be to lose both of your children in this way. This is one other final piece I managed to pick. I think is really pretty. The stationery that was written to Mrs. Maitland Dougal by one of her friends who was in transit down from Prince Rupert down to Vancouver on the Canadian National Steamship lines. So in summary, for me, exploring social history, the people and the places, is really the more important and more interesting part of collecting postal history stuff. Obviously, you have to enjoy doing some research, but it really isn't necessary to have a huge collection. As I think I've tried to show, sometimes you can learn a lot about just one single cover if you're prepared to do a bit of digging. And obviously, there's a certain amount of luck involved as well. And I found that if you focus on a particular specific geographic area, it can lead to some really interesting discoveries. So that's it for my presentation. Bob, I'm going to stop the sharing and see if there's any questions.
Okay.
I have a question, Bruce. This is Fred Pritchard. I, like you, have gotten into postal history through family when I've got a collection or accumulation of things from my great grandparents who are postmasters, and their son was the postmaster of a small place in Pontiac County, Quebec, which is on the opposite Ottawa, about 40 miles upriver. And I know a lot about the family history, so these covers are kind of nice to have. And but I've been struggling. Is that kind of interesting for people how do you make it interesting for people in a postal history sense when you're really coming at it from a family sense and you know the people, you know how they're related? How do you make that interesting
Yeah,
from a postal history perspective, um, for someone who's not family, if you know what I mean? That's what I'm struggling with.
yeah, no, I understand exactly what it's like. Well, why would anybody care that that's my
Yeah.
great grandfather in that picture in that land clearing party? You know, you're quite right. It's a bit of a challenge, but sometimes you might not get a whole frame exhibit out of it, but you might get a short article. Just I found that even just digging into how the family came to live in the area,
Mhm.
and just the story of the family itself can be nicely illustrated using some of those pieces that you've got. But if you've got something from particular family members, can you
Mhm.
weave that into your story about how they came to be here and what they did?
Yeah, so I know quite a bit about that history. And the other thought I had was this was a village that became, when a railroad came through, it became like the hub of the community in the 1880s, 90s, up through about 1940s. But that if you went there today, nothing exists, and there must be hundreds of towns across Canada like that. That they're kind of like lost communities. And I always thought that would be a very interesting study to take lost communities, say from Maritime and something from Central Canada and something from Western Canada, and compare and contrast them through postal stuff. That could be kind of fun.
Well, you're right, and we've got Gus Neerum on the call here today, and that's one of the things that he loves to do. He loves to find these old, obscure places that are long gone, and
Right.
he can tell you some really fascinating stories. Gus has been another great, I'm just fascinated by his research. Gus is a great resource guy. So yeah. But no, you're right. I think you can find interesting stories and just to try to track what happened to some of these long lost places. Yeah.
I'd like to just add something in there. Yeah, I'm on. When I listen to something like Bruce just presented, it's not so much that I like each cover, but rather his process of how he goes about doing it. And what can I learn from that in
Mhm.
terms of what I'm doing?
Mhm.
And I think I look at every one of the presentations we saw today, and I said, what can I learn from that
Mhm.
in applying to what I'm doing? And I love doing it.
Yeah. Yeah.
When I write up one of my stories, I feel like I'm sitting right there and the black flies are coming and I'm swatting them.
Yeah, that's right. No, for me, because I'm studying a particular area, I live close to it today. I can go to all those places. I can go. Actually one of the early post offices in the Cowichan Valley, which is now gone, was actually on the land of a guy I know in up in Duncan. So there's a personal connection there that, yeah, you're right. It might not interest everybody, but I think there's ways of pulling out small stories and helping people learn more about them.
I think it's 95% about you yourself and the joy and fun that you have, researching and putting together those stories. And sometimes, again, sharing the stories and the process is of interest to everyone. I mean, this is today's presentations have been a
Mhm.
remarkable, I think, example of that.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think so. Brenda, did you have a question?
Tops, yes.
Yeah, I'm
Well, I
just
think it just
fascinated.
sorry, Tops. I think Brenda had she's just, you have to unmute your microphone, Brenda. Sorry, Tops. She had her hand
No
up.
problem.
No,
You're muted.
uh, I
There we
can't.
go.
Okay.
There you
There
go.
we go. Okay, yep.
Okay. Are we
Yep.
good?
Yep.
Okay, so, sorry, I was getting a message saying I was muted on your end. Sorry for my background. I'm working in my garage today, but I'm paying attention. So it's the earlier comment is interesting because I'm coming at it from the other end, in the sense that I don't know a lot about postal history. But as I'm researching the cards, I particularly focus on real photo postcards from southern New Brunswick. And I'm coming up with some very interesting series of cards and connections in small communities, which are leading me to a lot of additional research as you are doing. But I'm also learning a lot about the postal history connections and things that I'm not aware of. And seeing how those things fit, i.e. Lord's Cove, who had a post office on Deer Island, and then it was discontinued. So one of the series that I have is, a series of postal stamps and cancellations from the Lord's Cove post office. So I'm quite new to the whole postal history side of it, but a lot of what I'm doing, I'm seeing a lot of interesting connections with my photo postcard research. So this has been very good, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think sometimes you don't know what kind of collection you've got until you sort of step back and look at it, and then you realize, oh, there's a connection here and here. There's a thread that runs through these things. Yeah. Sorry, Tops, did you want to?
Yeah, I just have a comment. I was just fascinated by the fact that this was essentially family history, but it has a ripple effect, whether it be to the mayor of St. John's or a constable or an Indian agent, and it sort of focuses on those circumstances and the people involved and enhances our knowledge of the history of the area.
Yeah.
Very
yeah.
good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Our time is largely come to an end, so I'm going to stop recording.